Hello, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Reading Little Blue Books Out Loud while stoned. In this video, we're going to do part 2 of Little Blue Book number 1122, titled The Degradation of Woman, written by Joseph McCabe. And we left off... Sorry about that. And we left off in the first video on page 19, partway through chapter 2. So, get a little scratch. And here we go. That is why Rebecca, coming from the female slavery of Judea, would find in benighted Babylon. And woman was just as free, equal, independent, and respected in ancient Egypt. Every single authority on ancient Egypt will tell you that. Flinders Petrie even observes that in the home the husband was merely a sort of boarder, a visitor, who had to keep up the establishment. Maspero, another of the chief authorities, put it that the husband was a privileged guest, that the many tomb inscriptions show that the wife was the beloved of her husband and the mistress of the house. There was no stick as thick as a thumb in the corner, as no exploitation or bullying, no appropriation of her earnings or property. In the maxims of Ptah Hetep, a middle-class treaty of 4,000 years ago or more, it is said, "She will be doubly attached if the chain is sweet to her." Of course, there was a chain, a contract of marriage, but it was mutual. Make glad her heart during the time that thou hast. The counsel to the husband ran, and even in case of misconduct he was urged, be kind to her for a season. Send her not away, let her have food to eat. Polygamy was permitted in Egypt, but a wife could, and did, stipulate in her marriage contract that there should be none. It is one of the higher religions, Mohammedanism, in this respect borrowing from Judaism, which has brought degradation upon the woman of Egypt. For the 4,000 years of life of the old pagan civilization, she was the equal of man in all respects. She could not only bring an action on her own account in court, but she could plead, she could practice medicine, she had a great career as a priestess, and the female deity Isis was one of the most famous and revered, and in later times, one of the most ethical in the pantheon. The Christian Madonna and Child is based most particularly upon the popular Egyptian representation of Isis and Horus. Mary is an understudy of Isis and Ishtar. As in Babylonia, there was no political opportunity for either sex, since the form of government was a despotic monarchy, so that women had no special injustice here. In the palace, she was treated as an equal, and there were queens who made great names in Egyptian history. It was most probably Queen Tu, the mother of Amenhotep IV, who brought about the religious revolution which substituted the worship of one god for the polytheism of the Egyptian temples. The beginning of civilization is dated by different authorities at various periods between 3000 and 4000 BC. This means that the stretch of time during which Egypt and Babylon were the chief representatives of civilization is far greater than the whole of subsequent history, and during all that time woman was free, independent, and equal of men. She was treated with justice and respect. The only other civilizations were those of the Cretans, the Hittites, and the Chinese. The Cretan is the most interesting, since it began as early as the great kingdoms of Egypt and Mesopotamia. We have not yet discovered the key to the Cretan language, and our knowledge is therefore imperfect. But if there is one point on which the authorities are agreed, and upon which they feel justified in expressing an opinion, is in the position of woman. The fact that Crete had no male deity, but only the Mother Earth goddess, would dispose us to expect to find women in an excellent position. That sex cannot be held inferior, which is the sex of the deity. But we have ample indications of the fact. The frescoes on the walls of the Knossos Palace plainly show that there was no oriental confinement of women. They are depicted enjoying themselves on the terrace of the great palace, just as ladies do on the terrace of the modern mansions. The impression of every student of Cretan remains, is that women probably had, in the Cretan civilization, an even better position than they had in Egypt and Babylonia. In regard to the Hittite civilization, we can say nothing. The inscriptions cannot be deciphered, and we must leave it out of consideration, as it was not nearly so old or so important a civilization as the preceding three. This need not concern us, nor need we linger over the position of women in China. The Chinese civilization is 1,000 years younger than those of the West, and on account of its complete isolation until modern times, it need not be considered here. We are concerned with that particular evolution of the human race into which Christianity entered as an influence. Looking back in the light of what I have said upon that evolution, and taking the position of woman as a test of civilization, we should have to divide the whole into two eras, the era of light and justice, and the era of darkness and injustice. And it is an elementary historical truth to say that the era of light is the period before Christ, and the era of darkness the time which we proudly call the Christian era. It is also an elementary and uncontroverted historical truth that the recovery of women, the removal of her wrongs, did not begin until the Christian domination of the world was profoundly shaken and reduced. It made progress in proportion as the churches grew weaker. It received no assistance whatever from Christianity, and it was brought to a triumphant issue only when the majority of men in the cities of the world had thrown off their allegiance to Christianity. These are statements of fact, not rhetoric. I have shown this for the period before Christ, and later chapters will establish the rest. And it would hardly be possible to frame a more deadly reply than these facts give to the claim that Christianity has been woman's best friend. There is only one qualification to be made in this general statement. Egypt and Babylon did not bring the story of women's equality down to the beginning of the Christian era. And the influence of Christianity, on the other hand, did not begin until about the end of the 4th century. This leaves a period of 8 or 9 centuries between what I have called the era of light and the era of darkness. That period is filled with the stories of Greece and Rome. And we have next to see whether it may not have been these which inaugurated the degradation of women, and whether the church did not simply inherit an unjust social order for which it was not responsible. The further question, what the effect of the destruction of Roman civilization by the northern barbarians was likely to be, will be considered in a later chapter. That is the end of chapter 2. And we'll pause right there. Fix my cotton mouth. Now, chapter 3. The Greek and Roman woman. Let us say at once that in the Greek and Roman civilizations, women had not the position of equality and freedom which she had had in Egypt, Mesopotamia, and apparently Crete. In different strains of the human family, a different attitude was adopted toward women. In the Semitic race, to which the Hebrews belonged, a harsh and masterful attitude was evolved. whereas amongst the Egyptians and Mesopotamians, women seem to have been the community, not because she was the mother, but because her personality was as justly recognized as that of the man. In the Indo-Persian European family, the attitude was totally different in different branches. The slavery of the Hindu woman of recent times is not, perhaps, her original situation. But there must, from the first, have been a domineering attitude toward women. In the Teutonic branch of the family, on the contrary, woman was, as I will tell later, highly respected. The Greek and Romans come between these two extremes. Amongst the early Romans, especially, the man had a quite despotic power over the woman, though it was not abused as one finds it abused amongst the Hebrews and Hindus, and it soon disappeared. No doubt, if we could trace the circumstances in which each of these branches of the human family slowly advanced towards civilization, we should easily understand the different attitudes. Human evolution as a surely guide by material conditions as a river is by the course which physical conditions prescribe for it. But we can no longer trace this evolution. At one time, it was widely thought that in the semi-civilized state of the race, there was a general, if not universal, rule of the mother over the community, a matriarchate. There are local traces of such a rule, but I do not think that any sociologist now believes it to have been at any time the general or a very widespread institution. The earlier attitude of the Greeks toward women does not concern us much. She was in a position of dependence and inequality, but certainly not of degradation. Polygamy was abandoned before the historical period opened, and another change of which we have some trace improved the lot of the woman, or of the wife. Originally, it had been the custom, as in many savage and barbaric tribes, for the wooer to make a present to the girl's father. Very early this was changed into a gift from her father, so that she was no longer a chattel, an article to be bargained for and bought. In the earliest Greek literature, in fact, women already had a position of respect, if not honor. Some noble types of wives are described in the Homeric poems, and the great tragedians of the earlier part of the brilliant career of Athens have given the world some of the finest types of womanhood in all literature. Not scheming assassins like Judith, not bloodless and loveless automata like the Christian saints. And aesthetics, that doesn't seem right, like the Christian saints, and aesthetics, but normal women bearing their part in life bravely and honorably and sweetly. It didn't make sense to my brain. When the full light of history falls upon the Greek community, we find women in a position that certainly would not accord with modern standards. A special and secluded part of the home was set apart for the woman, and while their excursions from the home were restricted, the men had full liberty. Athens and most of Greek city-states were democracies, yet women had no part whatever in the political life. Her place was the home. Girls, it is true, had a life of comparative freedom, and one feels that they would say happiness. They had excellent athletic training, music, games, and graceful dancing. The old idea that a woman was a man's property to be carefully guarded from a defilement that lowered her value persisted, but there was no note of contempt, no insinuation, as in Judea, that she was unclean and useful only as a breeder of men. She was the companion of man, but it was understood that politics and war were not her concern. She was excluded from public life. Quite early in Greek life, however, a movement began for the removal of whatever wrongs and disabilities she had. The Medea of the great tragedian Euripides is one of the most poignant presentments of the case for women that was ever given to the world. Its exaggeration is so great, yet so sincerely and profoundly felt, that no woman genius could have penned a more formidable complaint. Already, also, the Greeks had the poetry of Sappho, a brilliant practical demonstration of woman's independence. The historian Herodotus also shows, Mahaffy says, a fair and gentle attitude toward women. In fact, in the best days of Athenian prosperity, there was a woman's movement akin to that of modern times. Professor Mahaffy suggests that it was contact with the Parisians in Asia Minor, which had moved the better class Athenians, wives and daughters of the workers were, he says, sufficiently free to enclose their wives and daughters in something like the Oriental fashion, that it was not due to any general contempt of women. He proves by quoting a case in which two married women, prisoners of war, sent a complaint to Athens against an Athenian general. The complaint was, he says, received by the Athenian democracy with such an outburst of indignation that he, the general, committed suicide in open court to avoid the sentence. Such complaints were not listened to in Europe during the World War. I remark in another book, Little Blue Book number 1078, upon a fairness of the Rev. Professor Mahaffy, a high authority in dealing with the morals of the Greeks. He shows, with the same fairness, that a movement for the removing of the disabilities of women began in Athens several centuries before Christ was born. It seems, as we should expect, to have been connected with the famous Aspasia, one of the most brilliant and most respected ladies of antiquity. A friend of the leading writers, that's not the right page, there it is, a friend of the leading writers and statesmen of Athens. The comedian Aristophanes ridiculed the movement, but the philosopher Plato defended it, as apparently Socrates had done before him. We may, in fact, infer that this women's rights movement of 2,200 years ago had very solid support amongst the educated men of Athens, and it was clearly of sufficient importance for the greatest of the comedians to devote two plays to it, Lysistrate and the Ecclesiastia. It might also be, in the latter play, Aristophanes ironically describes the women of Athens donning male dress and taking over the work of making laws and reforming the man-made state. Thus, the fight which agitated England and America in the last part of the 19th and early part of the 20th century really began and reached important proportions in Athens in the 4th century before Christ. It was the mass of the people who ridiculed the movement as modern crowds ridiculed the suffragettes. Educated men realized that although it was unquestionably part of the ideal of a Greek gentleman to see that his wife was happy, the position of women was unjust. Plato eloquently pleaded that women had, though in a less developed form, the same faculties as men, and ought to have the same education. Her supposed unfitness for political life he caustically ridiculed. Epicurus, who closes the long line of Greek thinkers, had no interest in politics. He urged both men and women to avoid the corrupt and turbulent life of politics and cultivate a sober tranquility within the limits of his own ideal. However, he welcomed men and women on equal terms. Thus, Greece, to which religious writers appeal as an example of antagonism of the most brilliant of the pagan civilizations to women, proves to be exactly the contrary. For 3,000 or 4,000 years in Crete, Egypt, and Mesopotamia, women had been free and respected. Then, for a few centuries, we find her in Greece, not degraded or vilely used. For nearly every great Greek writer treats her with respect, but certainly in a position of dependence and inferiority. But at the very dawn of the golden age of Athens, a movement for her emancipation begins, and it has the support of all the best elements of Greek life. Unfortunately, Athens was ruined before the movement could reach a successful issue. Yet its ideals continued. The chief Greek writer about the time of Christ, Plutarch, maintained that women was mentally and morally equal to men, and ought to have, as Plato had said, the same education. He denied that the moral law should be interpreted more liberally in the case of man than in woman, and the last glimpse that we have in history of Greek culture before it is entirely lost in a Christianized and barbarized world is a picture of the philosopher Hypatia, taking a leading part in the life of the great city of Alexandria, and by her culture and personality rising high above all her contemporaries. The murder of Hypatia by the Christian mob is a fitting allegory of the murder of the new hope of women by the new religion. That may seem a harsh sentence, but even the broad historical facts must give the modern Christian woman grounds for reflection. A movement for the emancipation of women from grievances far lighter than those of a century ago began in Greece nearly 2,300 years ago. It gathered force and was endorsed by the most influential Greek writers, but it completely disappeared when Christianity became the religion of Europe, and it did not reappear until skepticism about Christianity spread through the civilized world. We shall see that the prejudice which this broad fact creates against the new religion is fully confirmed by the study of a Christian teaching. First, however, we must carefully consider the position of women in the Roman civilization with which Christianity came into actual contact. It is usual in religion literature to divide Roman history into two parts. A first part, until a century or two before the birth of Christ, in which woman was very virtuous and but a slave, and a later part in which she was free but very wicked. This generalization is as false as most of the other historical statements upon which the supposed service to the race of the new religion is based. The women of the Roman Republic in its earlier centuries were assuredly very chaste and virtuous. The names of some of them rank with the names of Christian saints, but just as the chastity of the saint is a kind of commercial venture, the price of a colossal reward in heaven, so the virtue of the early Roman maid or matron may be attributed to fear of the lash or the knife. The women were the property of the men. They ranked with the children. The law did not enter a Roman's house. He had power of life and death over his wife, his children, and his slaves. Small wonder that the wife and daughters were very virtuous. Yet, even here, woman was far better treated than she was in Judea. One of the Roman historians, Valerius Maximus, makes the almost incredible claim that there were no divorce in the Roman Republic for 520 years after its foundation. The Jewish civilization, the real, not the legendary, civilization of the Hebrews, was practically a contemporary of the Roman, and a record of women's experience in the two would be an instructive document. Roman women were not confined in special quarters of the house, were not forbidden to go out to dine or to the theater, and had not separate places in the temple. They were treated with the greatest respect at home and abroad. Moreover, the tyranny of the older Roman custom broke down long before the time of Christ. Greece had been civilized only a few centuries, not 1,500 years like Christian Europe, when it started a movement for the emancipation of women. Rome, similarly, was civilized only some 3 or 4 centuries when its women began a formidable movement for emancipation and admission to political life. In the 2nd century before Christ, scenes curiously like those of the suffrage struggle of modern times were witnessed in Rome. Crowds of women obstructed the way of the reactionary senator and loudly demanded their rights. And I may add that their greatest opponent, Cato the Elder, the personification of the old Roman discipline, is nevertheless reported to have said, "A man who beats his wife or his children lays impious hands on that which is most holy and most sacred in the world." As to property, Roman women had already, in 215 BC, become so wealthy that a special war measure, was passed restricting their property. The suffrage, or share in political life, was not won in Rome because long before the birth of Christ, the men themselves lost or surrendered their political power. The republic became an empire. There were still municipal elections, and as election addresses, which were found in the ruins of the buried city in Pompeii, informed us, women took an active part in these. In the provinces, the instructions show, women sometimes held high municipal offices. At Rome, there were women's clubs, where the affairs of the city and the state were keenly discussed. A Roman woman could hold property just as well as a man, and was often very rich and independent. Men, in fact, grumbled, as in ancient Egypt, that their wives charged an excessive interest on the money they lent their husbands. Not only the later and more liberal ideas of the Greek philosophers, but the humanitarian precepts of the Stoic ethic had entered into the blood of Rome and softened the harshness of its old discipline. The old law, says the famous jurist Sir Henry Maine, had fallen into complete discredit and was verging on extinction. The end of the 1st century and greater part of the 2nd century of the Christian era were a well-recognized Stoic period. At Rome and the emperors, a splendid series of monarchs allowed the Stoic lawyers to infuse their humanitarian ideals into the law concerning women and the slave. Education was, and we shall see, organized on a most generous basis, and philanthropy covered Italy with orphanages and homes for the aged and ailing. Anyone who knows the inscriptions, says Sir Samuel Dill, may be inclined to doubt whether private benefactions under the Antonines were less frequent and generous than in our own day. We will return to this later. But this great Stoic doctrine of the brotherhood and equality of men, as Sir Samuel Dill calls it, completed the work of the emancipation of women from the tyranny of the old institutions. Sir Henry Maine, perhaps the highest authority on Roman law, says of Gaius, one of the famous Stoic lawyers of the time, and this is what he says: "The great jurisconsult himself scouts the popular apology offered for it, the old law, in the moral inferiority of the female sex, and a considerable part of his volume is taken up with descriptions of the numerous expedients, some of them displaying extraordinary ingenuity, which the Roman lawyers had devised for enabling women to defeat the ancient rules, led by their theory of natural law. The jurisconsults had evidently, at this time, assumed the equality of the sexes as a principle of their code of equality. Women had, in short, just been freed from the grievances which the old Greek and Roman tradition had laid on her at the time when the Christian council was spreading through the Roman world. By the end of the 2nd century, she was socially and legally as free as the modern woman, and she remained free to the end of the empire. When the influence of Christianity began, in the 4th century, paganism had recovered from the temporary injustice to women, throughout the range of Roman law, which means throughout civilization at the time. There was no degradation or subjection of women, yet 15 centuries of degradation and subjection followed. Could there be a more ironic comment on the preacher's eloquent and constant plea that Christianity brought into the world the doctrine of the brotherhood of men? It was precisely the great Stoic doctrine of the brotherhood and equality of men, as the Protestant historians call it, which had emancipated women. It was the new Christian doctrine of the inequality of the sexes which degraded her. The Christian scholars who claim that at least the new religion taught men a reverence for women are almost completely ignorant of the facts. They rely only on the usual rhetoric about the vices of the pagans and the virtues of the Christians, the falseness of which I show in another little blue book, number 1078. All this rhetoric is based upon the most scandalous loose quotation of particular instances. Even the best Christian writer asks us to blush at the crimes of Nero or Elagabalus, and never mention that during 3/4 of the empire its rulers were good men. They say dark and vague things about the vices of Messalina and Photostine, which are grossly exaggerated, and they never tell that there were 10 good pagan empresses for every bad one. They quote St. Jerome about the virtue of his score of Christian pupils, and they entirely ignore his assurance in the same letters that the Christian world generally was vicious and corrupt. There was no such general contrast of pagan vice and Christian virtue, and the notion that at the adoption of Christianity the world passed from an era of vice to one of virtue, from a period in which women were the toy of brutal lusts to a period in which she was respected because of her Christian virtue, is, as we shall see, one of the most fantastic and unjustifiable beliefs that zeal ever engendered. And that is the end of chapter 3. And that is the end of part 2 of Little Blue Book number 1122, titled The Degradation of Women, written by Joseph McCabe. Thanks for listening, and join me in part 3.